In the years leading up to World War II, the Soviet Union proclaimed itself the vanguard of social progress and gender equality. Communist ideology, in its most orthodox form, had promised the abolition of hierarchies and the total liberation of the individual regardless of origin or gender. In party speeches, the Soviet woman was a symbol of the new era: worker, mother, peasant, engineer, soldier if necessary. However, between Kremlin rhetoric and everyday reality, there was a chasm difficult to ignore. During the 1930s, as the state industrialized at a ferocious pace under Stalin's 5-year plans, millions of women entered the labor market, but not on equal terms. They were often relegated to heavy, low-paid work without recognition. The ideal of emancipation coexisted with a deeply patriarchal society where domestic roles remained the norm. Soviet laws had granted women unprecedented civil rights such as divorce, legal abortion, and technical education, but tradition and social structure continued to drag the old inertia of the Tsarist Empire. Forced collectivization of the countryside also had a devastating impact. In villages, many women were left alone after the deportation or execution of their husbands labeled as kulaks, wealthy peasants considered enemies of the state. They had to manage the land, children, and survival. In this context, a generation of women hardened by scarcity, disciplined, and accustomed to obedience to the party emerged. Unknowingly, they were the perfect mold for the type of fighter the Soviet Union would need a decade later. In urban centers, propaganda worked to construct the image of the new Soviet woman. Heroic portraits of tractor drivers, factory workers, miners, and athletes adorned the walls of factories and schools. The state needed women to work as much as men, not just for ideology, but out of economic necessity. During the years of industrialization, millions of men were absorbed by the Red Army or large infrastructure projects. Women filled that gap, driving trains, repairing engines, operating cranes, and studying engineering. In military academies, however, their presence remained marginal. The Red Army admitted women mainly as nurses, doctors, or logistical assistants. The idea of a woman wielding a rifle or engaging in direct combat was foreign even to the most ardent supporters of Soviet egalitarianism. The Russian Civil War had examples of women fighters, but the military institution considered them romantic exceptions, not role models. Nevertheless, a profound change was underway in youth and paramilitary education. OSOAVIAXIM, a civil defense organization founded in 1927, offered basic training in shooting, navigation, first aid, and camouflage techniques to young people of both sexes. In shooting clubs in Leningrad, Moscow, and Kyiv, thousands of girls learned to handle the Mosin Nagant rifle, unaware that this knowledge would one day decide life or death. For the Soviet state, training was no curiosity, it was part of patriotic indoctrination. Instructors, veterans of the Civil War, taught that shooting was an act of defending socialism. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and war began in Europe, the USSR watched events with a mixture of caution and ambition. Stalin had purged the high command, leaving the Red Army weakened. In the barracks, female participation in combat was not yet discussed, but shooting schools continued to train volunteers who saw the weapon as a tool of liberation and national pride. In 1941, the German-Soviet non-aggression pact was broken with Operation Barbarossa. Suddenly, the Soviet Union was engulfed in a war of extermination. In the first months, millions of men were annihilated or captured, and the state urgently needed to replace them. For the first time, women were called upon not only as nurses or cooks, but as frontline fighters. The party's slogan was clear: every Soviet citizen must defend the motherland, regardless of gender. The change was abrupt and brutal. Thousands of women, driven by patriotism, a desire for revenge, or sheer survival, volunteered. Some were assigned to artillery or communications units, others to light infantry, but a small group with exceptional aim and nerves of steel was selected for a far more precise and lethal task: to become snipers. This decision, later seen as one of the Red Army's boldest moves, arose out of both desperation and pragmatism. Women were found to possess psychological and physiological abilities that made them particularly effective in precision warfare, patience, attention to detail, emotional composure. Virtues that on a frozen battlefield or among the ruins of a city could decide victory with a single shot. The creation of the Soviet sniper programs. When Hitler's armies crossed the Soviet border in June 1941, the Kremlin's military command realized that the war would neither be short nor conventional. Within weeks, more than 2 million Red Army soldiers were killed or captured. The chaos at the fronts forced the Soviet state to mobilize all its human resources. It was then that an idea previously considered marginal gained strategic importance: the systematic recruitment and training of women as snipers. The initiative did not arise from a propagandistic impulse, but from practical necessity. The High Command observed that in the occupied zones and rear areas, many women who could handle weapons were already participating as partisans or local defenders. Several of them had received sports shooting instruction through the OSOAVIAXHIM organization, which promoted marksmanship as a patriotic virtue. That civilian foundation became the seed of an unprecedented military corps. The People's Commissariat of Defense issued orders to create female precision shooter units. The first calls were published in local newspapers and disseminated by Komsomol committees, the communist youth. Recruitment offices were flooded with young women, peasants, students, teachers, office workers, many barely of age. The selection process was strict. Ideological enthusiasm was not enough. Excellent vision, emotional stability, fine coordination, and an impeccable discipline record were required. Those selected were sent to training centers across the Soviet territory, with the most emblematic being the Central Female Sniper School in Podolsk, founded in 1942, about 50 kilometers south of Moscow. That place, amid dense forests and improvised buildings, became the heart of the program. The training day was relentless. From dawn, recruits ran several kilometers carrying Mosin Nagant bolt-action rifles, model 1891/30, with PE or PU scopes. Theoretical classes included ballistics, wind calculation, distance compensation, camouflage, and survival in extreme conditions. Instructors, veteran soldiers hardened by front-line failures, taught that a sniper had to think like a hunter, patient, invisible, and lethal. On the shooting ranges, women learned more than just shooting. They practiced silent movement, breath control, and environmental awareness. They were trained to remain motionless for hours, enduring cold or insects without revealing their position. They also learned to disguise themselves in grass or snow, cover their face with mud or soot, and imitate shadows and textures. Training not only sought technical skill, but molded a new psychology, where the mind had to completely control the body. The program imposed a strict ethical code. A sniper must not shoot on impulse or reveal her position under any circumstances. She was taught to choose the exact moment, wait for the enemy's final breath, and anticipate the opposing squad's reaction. Each shot was both a moral and tactical decision. Instructors, many of them pioneers of the movement, emphasized that the responsibility of a single shot could change the course of a battle. In Podolsk and other smaller academies, training lasted 2 to 6 months, depending on individual performance. At the end of the course, the best received special badges and the rank of non-commissioned officer. Those who demonstrated exceptional cold-bloodedness were appointed field instructors, responsible for training new recruits near the front. It is estimated that between 1942 and 1945, more than 2,000 women completed training as qualified Red Army snipers. The success of these schools was largely due to the meticulous adaptation of the Mosin Nagant rifle. Although originally designed for infantry, its scoped version was modified for smaller hands and lower shooting positions. Soviet technicians realized that female body stability, with a lower center of gravity, could offer accuracy advantages. Reports from Podolsk mentioned cases of recruits capable of hitting targets at 600 meters with barely a 2-centimeter deviation. Military pedagogy also emphasized psychological resilience. Each trainee had to get used to isolation. During exercises, they were sent alone into the forest, where they had to remain for 24 hours without being detected by instructors. Those who were discovered were expelled from the course. It was not just about teaching shooting, but about forging character, coldness in the face of death, calmness amid chaos. The program was led by figures such as Major Mikhail Nikitin and Lieutenant Alexei Koroshilov, veterans who believed in women's capacity for lethal precision. Nikitin argued that women were less prone to panic and more disciplined in executing orders. Koroshilov, for his part, developed camouflage techniques inspired by the hunting tactics of Siberian peoples, adapting fabrics, branches, and white cloaks that blended into the snowy landscape. Soviet propaganda soon discovered the symbolic value of these units. Newsreels showed images of young women with serene faces holding rifles almost as large as themselves, smiling at the camera before returning to the front. Those photographs were published in newspapers and posters with slogans such as "She defends the homeland" or "Every bullet counts for victory." In a country torn by invasion, these images became an emotional stimulus and a political message. The Soviet Union fought with all its strength, including female strength. In parallel, regional programs were created in Belarus, Ukraine, the Urals, and Siberia. Not all schools had the same level of rigor, but they shared a common spirit. In each training camp, groups of 10 to 12 women were formed, later deployed in pairs known as hunting cells. Cooperation was essential. One observed with binoculars, the other fired. That duo, in absolute silence, learned to communicate with minimal gestures or simple head movements. Training also included studying the enemy. Female snipers learned to identify German ranks by insignia, helmets, or behavior. They were taught to prioritize targets: officers, observers, radio operators, or artillerymen. The goal was not to accumulate kills, but to dismantle the enemy command structure. Every shot had to have a strategic purpose. The result of this effort was an elite corps combining discipline, precision, and unbreakable coldness. By the end of 1943, female snipers were an integral part of the Red Army. They were estimated to operate on almost all fronts, from the ruins of Stalingrad to the forests of Karelia. In confidential reports, German officers described the fear they caused. Russian snipers are relentless, but women are even worse. They do not rest, they do not miss, and they do not reveal themselves. Among the Podolsk graduates emerged legendary names: Lyudmila Pavlichenko, Tatiana Kosterina, Nina Petrova, Rosa Shanina, women whose confirmed kill counts rivaled those of the best male shooters on the front. Their fame was used by the state as a symbol of socialist victory, but behind the heroic portraits lay a harsher reality: lonely days, hunger, and hand-to-hand combat where one mistake meant death. The Soviet female sniper program not only changed the perception of women's role in war, it also redefined the idea of precision as a political tool. Every shot fired by these young women was a statement of state power, but also a silent declaration of individual independence against the enemy. Official figures were never exact, but decades later, declassified military archives revealed the magnitude of the phenomenon. Over 11,000 women actively participated in combat as snipers or precision assistants, and over 500 were decorated for acts of valor. Half of them did not return alive. The broken stereotype: why women excelled as snipers. At a time when physical strength seemed to define a soldier's worth, female precision became a paradox that the world had to accept at gunpoint. War, which broke down all social values, also erased the boundaries between genders. Where the body no longer mattered, the mind imposed its dominance. And in the art of marksmanship, Soviet women proved to be the deadliest. Reports from the Red Army from 1942 to 1944 show a constant: female snipers achieved higher accuracy rates, withstood combat stress better, and made fewer impulsive mistakes than their male counterparts. It was neither a coincidence nor a propaganda invention. It was the result of a combination of psychological, physical, and social traits, forged over years of deprivation, forced labor, and communist discipline. Unlike many young male recruits, Soviet women arrived at the front without heroic illusions. They had seen their families die under bombs, survived hunger, and knew the price of silence. For them, war did not awaken a desire for glory, but a cold will for justice. That emotional distance translated into a tactical advantage. They could wait for hours without moving, observing the enemy as if time had stopped. Soviet military psychologists, especially Dr. Yuri Berlikov, analyzed dozens of female snipers in 1943 to understand the source of their effectiveness. They discovered that their heart rate remained stable even in extreme danger, that their adrenaline levels dropped faster after a confrontation, and that their visual coordination was slightly superior, especially at medium distances. Berlikov wrote, "The sniper must be a machine that breathes and calculates." Women, by nature or training, reached that state more easily than men. Training had reinforced these qualities, but had not created them. From childhood, Soviet women had been taught to endure and obey. In collectivized fields, physical labor and constant party supervision taught them not to show weakness. This emotional repression imposed by life itself became a psychological shield at the front. Where a soldier might tremble at the first enemy shot, they merely adjusted the scope. The physiological component also played a role. Women with lower muscle mass and slower metabolism could remain still longer without betraying themselves with involuntary movements. Their breathing, slower and more rhythmic, favored weapon stability. Instructors in Podolsk called it the silent pulse, a natural cadence that allowed them to squeeze the trigger between two heartbeats. But the key to female success on the firing field was not only technical, it was mental. The sniper had to assume absolute isolation, being alone for days, buried in snow or mud, waiting for an opportunity that might never come. That solitude broke many men. Women, on the other hand, turned it into part of the ritual. The introspection that the civilian world considered weakness became a deadly strength. German officers, bewildered by the appearance of these invisible shooters, described them with a mixture of fear and contempt. In a 1943 report from Army Group North, a German commander wrote, "The Russians employ women who shoot without emotion, as if they had no soul. They are more patient than any man. If one falls, another takes his place in the same cover, with the same cold and empty expression." They did not know that this apparent coldness was the result of ideological and emotional upbringing that had erased any individual notion of suffering. Tactically, women demonstrated superior accuracy in urban environments, especially in close combat. In Stalingrad, their skills became crucial. Engagements took place not in open fields, but among ruins, staircases, windows, and rubble. There, where every shadow could hide an enemy, the female ability to observe, memorize, and move silently became a weapon. Soviet commanders began assigning snipers to specific sections of buildings, not as support, but as instruments of psychological terror. Propaganda reinforced this image. The photographs showed young and serene faces, covered with white scarves or fur hats, holding rifles longer than their arms. In every portrait, there was a contradiction: the innocence of youth and the coldness of execution. Soviet magazines called them daughters of the motherland, while German soldiers nicknamed them braided demons. The psychological impact on the enemy was enormous. German intelligence reports described entire units paralyzed by the fear of being watched. In some sectors of the front, troops avoided raising their heads from the trenches during the day. German commanders began offering rewards for every sniper killed, and rumors spread that Russian snipers practiced revenge rituals. It was a war within the war, silent, personal, invisible. The Soviets exploited this effect. The snipers did not only eliminate enemies, they disorganized entire regiments. Their mere presence in a sector could slow an advance or trigger a retreat. Enemy reconnaissance units lost confidence, and officers avoided exposure. In this context, Soviet snipers became symbols of a total war where every shot had strategic and moral value. But their effectiveness also sparked internal tensions. Some Soviet officers viewed the fame of these women with suspicion. In a male-dominated military structure, their success represented an implicit challenge to the traditional order. There were reports of sabotage, of snipers being sent to impossible positions or left without support. Yet, they continued to demonstrate that discipline, precision, and intellect could overcome brute force. The personal stories of these women reveal a common pattern, a calmness that bordered on inhumanity. Rosa Shanina, one of the most famous, wrote in her diary, "I don't like to kill, but I like to hit. It's different. When I aim, I feel the world stop." Her phrase summarizes the psychological abyss in which these fighters lived, the distance between duty and morality, between obedience and humanity. In the academies, instructors observed this phenomenon with a mix of amazement and respect. Many confessed that women understood the true meaning of the shot better than men, not an act of violence, but of absolute control. It was not about strength or courage, but mastery over fear. That mastery made them invincible. Statistics confirmed it. By the end of 1944, the average hit rate of Soviet snipers exceeded 70%, compared to 54% for male snipers. On some fronts, their effectiveness reached the point of changing enemy tactics. German troops began deploying mirrors, fake mannequins, or distraction movements to try to locate them. Almost never did it work. Meanwhile, within the Red Army itself, the figure of the sniper became a national myth. Young women received decorations, promotions, and visits from journalists. Yet behind that glory hid the psychological price: alienation. Many admitted they could no longer sleep, that their minds replayed the shots like endless echoes. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the Lady of Death. When the German invasion reached Ukraine in the summer of 1941, Lyudmila Mikhailovna Pavlichenko was 25 years old, studying history at Kiev University and dreaming of becoming a professor. She had grown up in a disciplined environment, the daughter of a metallurgical worker and a factory employee. From her adolescence, she had demonstrated unusual marksmanship in the OSO AVI-AXIM shooting clubs. That skill, which then seemed like a sporting curiosity, would become her destiny. When Germany crossed the Dnieper and began bombing Kyiv, Pavlichenko volunteered at the Red Army recruitment office. The officer in charge assumed she was seeking a nurse position. She placed her shooting diploma on the table and demanded to be sent to the front. After hours of insisting, she was given a Mosin Nagant rifle and assigned to the 25th Chapayev Rifle Division deployed near Odessa. On her first day of combat, she killed 2 German soldiers from an improvised camouflage position. When she returned to camp, her commander requested visual confirmation, thinking she was exaggerating. She was not. Those 2 shots marked the beginning of a career that would make her the deadliest sniper in modern history. Pavlichenko soon developed a personal method. Unlike other shooters who constantly changed positions, she preferred to prepare a single observation point, studying light, wind, and terrain until mastering every detail. She spent hours motionless, observing, waiting, barely breathing. The enemy never knew where the shot would come from. Her comrades said she had the gaze of someone no longer belonging to the civilian world. In Odessa, during the defense of the city between August and October 1941, she faced trained German snipers for the first time. She participated in precision duels where a shadow or a reflection could determine who would die first. On one occasion, she remained completely hidden behind a collapsed wall for 3 days, without sleeping or eating, waiting for her opponent to reveal his position. When he did, Pavlichenko fired a single shot. That bullet earned her first medal. With the fall of Odessa, her unit was transferred to Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula. There, the war became hell. Soviet troops were surrounded by air and sea under constant bombardment. Pavlichenko kept firing. By the end of 1942, she had reached 309 confirmed kills, including 36 enemy snipers. Military reports described her as a model of discipline and unparalleled precision. Her fame grew faster than the front. Soviet newspapers began publishing her name, and propaganda turned her into a symbol of resistance. She was young, attractive, and lethal. Posters showed her in a perfectly pressed uniform, rifle on her shoulder, with a slight smile. She was presented as the daughter of Ukraine who defended her homeland with a steady gaze and unshakable hand. Despite the mythologizing, Pavlichenko was not a complacent figure. In her partially preserved diaries, she wrote about the constant tension of hunting, the cold that paralyzed her fingers, and the silent guilt after each shot. In her diary, she noted, "Every enemy killed means one less life that would destroy my country. But it also means a voice that will no longer speak." Her thinking was pragmatic, not fanatical. She shot out of duty, not pleasure. The winter of 1942 was devastating. During a German offensive, an explosion wounded her face with grenade shrapnel. She was evacuated from Sevastopol by direct order of the High Command, which could not afford to lose its national heroine. Upon arriving in Moscow, she was received by the press and by Stalin himself. He awarded her the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the country's highest military honor. From then on, her role changed. The government decided to use her as a diplomatic symbol. In 1942, she was sent as part of an official mission to the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom to persuade the Allies to open a second front in Europe. It was the first time a Soviet combat woman set foot on U.S. soil. Her visit left a deep impression. In Washington, she met Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife, with whom she developed a sincere friendship. Western media, however, did not know how to treat her. Some journalists interviewed her as if she were an exotic curiosity. They asked if she wore makeup at the front or if she felt attracted to the men she had killed. Pavlichenko responded with cutting calm. At a conference in Chicago, exasperated by superficial questions, she replied, "I have 309 kills to my name. Don't you think I've already demonstrated enough femininity?" Her speech traveled across the country and transformed her image. The Lady of Death, as she was nicknamed by North American newspapers, became an icon of the war effort and a reminder that war had no gender. On stage, Pavlichenko spoke without dramatization, with a firm voice, recounting how precision could change the outcome of a battle. Upon her return to the USSR, her figure already belonged to Soviet mythology. However, her life after the front was not glorious. The war ended, and the heroine faced a country that did not know what to do with its female veterans. Rejected by military command for her fame and independence, she accepted a position as a researcher at the University of Kyiv. For years, she suffered from post-traumatic stress, chronic pain, and nightmares. She died in 1974 at the age of 58, quietly, far from the noise of parades. Today, her name is engraved on monuments in Ukraine, Russia, and Canada. Her rifle, preserved in a Moscow museum, still bears the marks of war. Each scratch on the metal represents a story that could not be told. Lyudmila Pavlichenko embodied the contradiction of her time, a woman shaped by the communist ideal who found in war both a form of freedom and condemnation. Her legacy transcended Soviet borders. She inspired generations of female soldiers in Eastern Europe, and her figure was studied by war psychologists as an example of extreme self-control. On the Sevastopol front, she became a legend among her comrades. They often said, "If Pavlichenko is aiming, the enemy is already dead." Nina Petrova and the sniper school of Veshinskaya. In a war dominated by young people, the figure of Nina Pavlovna Petrova stood out as an anomaly. When the German invasion began, she was nearly 50 years old, with grey hair and the serenity of someone who had lived too many lives. She was a physical education teacher in Leningrad, a woman accustomed to rigor and discipline. But in 1941, when the Nazis besieged the city, Petrova did not seek refuge. She volunteered to fight. Her story would transform the very concept of what a sniper could be. Unlike Lyudmila Pavlichenko, whose fame grew on the battlefield, Petrova would become legendary as an instructor. In the first months of the war, she was assigned to a local defense detachment where she taught young recruits to shoot and move among the ruins. Her accuracy was surgical. Within a few days, officers realized that her talent far exceeded that of most male shooters. She was soon transferred to the Veshinskaya region on the Don, where the Red Army was beginning to form its first formal sniper school with a scientific and systematic approach. The establishment, improvised in old-school buildings, was created in 1942 by order of the Defense Commissariat. Petrova was appointed chief instructor, responsible for training women from all Soviet republics. Under her command, the Veshinskaya school became a laboratory of precision and discipline. There, shooting was not the only thing taught, a mindset was forged. Petrova repeated a phrase that would become famous among her students: "A good sniper does not hate the enemy. She studies him." The day began before dawn. Recruits ran 3 kilometers with their rifles on their backs, performed endurance exercises, and then moved to the shooting range. Instruction combined ballistic theory with psychological training. Petrova believed that the mind was the true trigger. The finger only executed what the brain had calculated. She taught them to observe without haste, to read the wind direction in leaves or snow, to listen to silence. If one of them moved too much or breathed heavily, she had to repeat the exercise from the beginning. Unlike the Podolsk or Krasnodar academies, where classic military rigor predominated, the Veshinskaya school applied an almost artisanal approach. Petrova insisted that each shooter develop her own style. Some shot from a low position, others preferred heights or ruined structures. The goal was not uniformity, but effectiveness. Her philosophy was simple. The enemy does not see a soldier, he sees a shadow. And a shadow has no rules. Between 1942 and 1944, more than 1,400 women passed through the classrooms of Veshinskaya, of whom about 700 were sent directly to the front as certified snipers. The best received the rank of assistant instructors and returned to the field to train new generations. In total, it is estimated that Petrova's students eliminated more than 12,000 confirmed enemies, a figure no shooting school in the world would ever match. Petrova did not limit herself to teaching from a distance. She often accompanied her pupils on real training missions, observing their movements from trenches or hills. Her small, serene figure, rifle resting on her knees, inspired respect. Officers nicknamed her Baba Yaga, with a telescopic sight, alluding to the mythical witch from Russian tales, wise and formidable at the same time. But for her students, she was a mother and a teacher. During breaks, she read letters from home or spoke about books, reminding them that the war should not erase humanity. The reputation of the school spread quickly across the Eastern Front. Officers requested reinforcements from Veshinskaya when the situation became unbearable. These women were known for their precision, stealth, and fearlessness. Petrova had instilled a silent code: never shoot without purpose, never show your face, never forget the name of the first enemy killed. She said that this name should be kept like a prayer, not to repeat it, not to lose oneself. Among her most prominent students were Rosa Shanina and Klavdia Kalugina, young women who would soon become famous for their exploits in Belarus and East Prussia. Both remembered Petrova as a strict but fair instructor. Shanina wrote in her diary, "When Petrova walks, the air seems to follow her. She fears neither fire nor cold. She teaches us that the bullet is not what matters, but the moment before the shot." In 1944, with the Soviet offensive advancing westward, the school was temporarily relocated near the front to accelerate the training of new recruits. Petrova, who was already nearing 60, insisted on accompanying them. She refused medical permits and offers of retirement. In the winter of that same year, she was assigned to the Sniper Corps of the 3rd Belarusian Front, where she continued directing precision operations in real combat. Her experience became invaluable during battles in forests and frozen villages. Petrova applied advanced camouflage methods. She used sheets, frozen branches, and pieces of polished glass to reflect light and confuse enemy observers. On several occasions, she managed to have small groups of female snipers eliminate entire enemy units without suffering casualties. German troops began to fear the forests of the Don, where the trees seemed to watch them. On May 1, 1945, barely a week before the official end of the war in Europe, the military vehicle transporting Petrova was hit by enemy fire near the German city of Rostock. She died instantly. The news was received with sorrow throughout the Soviet Union. Her students, scattered across the front, learned of it days later, when Berlin had already fallen. In their notebooks, many wrote her name alongside the coordinates of the last shot. Posthumously, Nina Petrova was awarded the Order of Glory and the Medal for Valor, although her figure did not reach the media notoriety of Pavlichenko. Nevertheless, her influence was deeper. Her school, her method, and her legacy endured for decades in Soviet military manuals. In the post-war period, her techniques of camouflage, observation, and selective shooting would be studied by snipers worldwide. In 1965, one of her former students, now elderly, wrote in a letter to the Ministry of Defense, "She taught us to shoot, but above all, she taught us to wait. And in waiting, we learned not to be afraid." That phrase, now engraved on a commemorative plaque in Veshinskaya, summarizes Petrova's philosophy better than any biography: the absolute mastery of time and mind. The role of the school she led was not limited to technical training. At its core, it was a political act, the institutionalization of women as autonomous combatants within the Red Army. Under her command, precision ceased to be an individual talent and became a doctrine. In the final months of the war, as the fronts collapsed and villages were wiped off the map, her female snipers operated as invisible guardians of the Soviet advance. They were the eyes of the offensive, the pulse that did not falter. In the snows of the Don, where she once trained hundreds of women, fragments of her shooting ranges still remain. Among them, rusty shell casings and old telescopic sights covered in dirt. They are the traces of a generation that learned to kill not out of hatred but with determination. The female snipers in the defense of Stalingrad. Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was a crack in time. There, where the dust from factories mixed with the smoke of fires, the Soviet Union bet on its survival. Among the ruins of the industrial city, a war was fought that turned every window into a trench, every staircase into an ambush, every shadow into a threat. And in that urban labyrinth, silent and invisible, operated the Soviet female snipers. When the Germans launched the offensive in the summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht relied on a quick victory, but Stalingrad did not fall. The Volga River, which bordered the city, became a boundary between the world of the living and hell. The Red Army resisted meter by meter, and women were part of that resistance. Of the thousands who had passed through the schools of Podolsk and Veshenskaya, many were sent to the southern front. It is estimated that more than 400 female snipers directly participated in the defense of Stalingrad. The city, destroyed by bombings, offered perfect terrain for their work. Pockmarked facades, burned-out buildings, and piles of rubble created a network of natural positions. The shooters moved among ruins and basements, observing from holes in walls or factory towers. Amid the rubble and soot, camouflage became an art. They used rags, dust, even corpses to cover their bodies. They learned to blend with the environment, to disappear under the enemy's gaze. A sniper's work in Stalingrad was not just about shooting. It was about resisting fear. Combat was so close that they often heard the Germans' voices, the crunch of their boots on glass, the German orders echoing through the ruined hallways. Sometimes they waited hours for a single shot. Every bullet had to justify the risk. On an ordinary day, a shooter could kill 2 or 3 enemies, but the most important thing was the psychological effect, the invisible terror that paralyzed enemy troops. The stories of that winter are fragmentary, almost anonymous. It is known that sniper groups operated in cells of 2 or 3 women, coordinated by infantry units. In Stalingrad's central district, the shooters of the 200th Rifle Regiment were responsible for eliminating several enemy observers stationed in communication towers. Among them was Yevgenia Makieva, 22, who shot a German officer from over 600 meters in the middle of a snowfall, a shot her comrades would remember as the white bullet. The enemy also responded. The Germans deployed elite snipers, many of them veterans of the Western Front. Thus arose a parallel war, sniper duels. There were no rules and no mercy. If one fell, the other did not move until confirmed. The wait could last days. In the ruins of a metallurgical factory, young Anastasia Stepanova maintained a duel with a German sniper for 48 hours. When she killed him, she found a notebook next to the body with the phrase, "I am hunting a woman who does not breathe." Female accuracy surprised both sides. Soviet officers began assigning female snipers selective elimination tasks, enemy officers, radio operators, scouts. Their reports recorded not only casualties but also the effects on enemy morale. A single shot at the right moment could disperse an entire platoon. The psychological power of these women was incalculable. Among the most remembered names is Rosa Shanina, who, although she would later achieve fame in East Prussia, participated in Stalingrad's urban fighting as a trainee observer. She later wrote, "The smell of gunpowder was stronger than that of life. I learned that long silence can kill more than a bullet, that silence preceding each shot defined the city's atmosphere. The snipers also fought against their own bodies. Temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Remaining still meant freezing. Some wrapped themselves in blankets or covered themselves with pieces of skin torn from enemy uniforms. Others lit small coals hidden under the ground to avoid dying of hypothermia. None retreated. In the words of Commander Chuikov, they were tougher than the steel of the factories they defended. The training in schools, like Veshenskaya, had prepared women for this type of combat. They could calculate the trajectory of the wind filtering through the destroyed walls, distinguish reflections from telescopic sights in broken windows, or recognize the shadow of a helmet on the snow. They were hunters in a city devoured by hunger and shrapnel. Every mission involved extreme risk. Being discovered meant immediate death. The Germans fired artillery at any suspicious point, reducing entire buildings to dust just to eliminate a single sniper. The city became a precision board. On Lenin, Krasnaya, and Beketova streets, the shooters operated from rooftops or basements, moving only at night. Some worked in coordination with scouts who drew the enemy's attention to allow the final shot. Reports from October 1942 record more than 3,000 enemy casualties attributed exclusively to snipers, a quarter of which were women. The most emblematic confrontation was at Pavlov's house, an improvised fortification where a Soviet garrison resisted for 2 months. On the upper floors, 2 shooters maintained constant fire on the approaches. Their accuracy prevented the Germans from coming closer than 100 meters for weeks. None of them survived, but their intervention was recorded in official reports as crucial for the defense of the sector. The women did not only kill, they observed, reported, anticipated movements. The information they transmitted saved countless lives. In a war where communication was chaotic, their silence was a form of language. When a sniper marked a target, the artillery responded without questions. The psychological impact of their presence was so great that German soldiers began writing the word Heckenschützen in their letters, meaning sniper, as a synonym for inevitable death. German commanders had to boost morale by reminding them that no woman can surpass a German soldier. But in the ruins of Stalingrad, reality proved otherwise. The combination of female precision, knowledge of the terrain, and mental resilience made Soviet snipers key players in the siege. When finally, in February 1943, German surrender was imminent, many of them were still in position, still aiming, still waiting. The end of the battle brought no relief, only a dense silence covered with smoke and corpses. The echo of Stalingrad resonated throughout the Soviet Union. The snipers became a symbol of extreme sacrifice, of nameless patriotism. But while some celebrated survival, others were sent north, where temperatures would be even harsher and the battle even quieter. The role of female snipers in Leningrad and other places on the Northern Front. The siege of Leningrad was an open wound that lasted 872 days. More than a battle, it was a test of collective endurance against hunger, cold, and death. When the German armies closed the encirclement in September 1941, the city was cut off from the rest of the country. Winter arrived with a brutality even the oldest remembered not, and amid that desolation, Soviet female snipers found their most extreme stage. In Leningrad, the war had no defined fronts. The enemy was across the Neva, behind frozen walls and silent factories. The streets were cemeteries of ice, the buildings, ruins inhabited by shadows. There, the snipers operated under impossible conditions. The thermometer read 30 degrees below zero. The weapons froze. The optical sights fogged from their breath. Yet they fired. Every bullet had to pierce not only the enemy, but the dense air of despair. The women of the 3rd Shock Army and the 42nd Army were primarily responsible for maintaining control of the northern accesses to the city. They operated from rooftops, church towers, abandoned factories, and half-ruined buildings. On moonless nights, they crossed the frozen river to reach new positions. They moved in absolute silence, crawling over the snow, covered in hand-sewn white cloaks. Their camouflage blended with the Arctic landscape. They were ghosts in a colorless world. The cold was the most constant enemy. Fingers stuck to the trigger, eyebrows were covered in frost. To prevent their breath from giving away their position, many wrapped their mouths with gauze or scarves. The rifle had to stay dry. A single ice crystal could deflect the shot. Before aiming, they warmed the stock with bare hands. Even if that meant the risk of freezing, they learned to calculate wind speed among the snowflakes and to distinguish the dawn light from the reflection of a German helmet. The extreme conditions of the Northern Front shaped a new form of precision. Snipers no longer relied solely on sight, but on hearing. They listened to steps on the snow, the brushing of branches, the whistling of air among the rubble. In Karelia, near Lake Ladoga, a shooter named Yelena Kuznetsova managed to take down an enemy in complete darkness, guided only by the sound of a shovel digging in the ice. Lake Ladoga was also their path of life and death. When the ice was thick enough, Soviet convoys crossed the so-called Road of Life to supply the besieged city. Snipers watched the edges of this route from improvised trenches, protecting the transports from artillery attacks and saboteurs. It was silent and deadly work. Often they spent 3 days without moving, hidden in the snow, feeding on pieces of frozen bread and iced tea. In the Nevskaya Dubrovka and Pulkovo sectors, snipers became an essential part of the defensive system. They operated in pairs, alternating shifts to avoid exhaustion. One observed while the other aimed. In those conditions, patience was the only form of survival. When the enemy did not appear, they stayed still, motionless, until the body began to numb in the cold. Some froze to death, still with their eye glued to the sight. In the Red Army archives, fragments of their reports are preserved. Northwest sector, 3 confirmed casualties. Snow, 40 centimeters, temperature -25, no movement in 14 hours. The precision of military language left no room for emotion, but between the lines, the human dimension of the sacrifice can be guessed. Every number, every coordinate, was the trace of a woman who, alone among the ice, held a war that seemed endless. The enemy also recognized their effectiveness. The Germans began using Finnish snipers, experts in Arctic camouflage, to counter them. Those duels, fought silently under a white sky, were almost ritualistic. There was no crossfire or sound of explosions, only the dry report of a shot and then nothing. In the snow, one body remained motionless while the other kept waiting. The female presence on the northern front had a particular impact on Soviet morale. In a city where the civilian population was starving, stories of women fighting on the front line became a form of hope. Local newspapers published their names, sometimes accompanied by drawings or patriotic verses. One of them, Marina Oktyabrskaya, wrote in a letter, "Snow shows no mercy. Neither do I." Her phrase was reproduced on the walls of Leningrad as a motto of resistance. Further north in Murmansk and the Kola Peninsula, the snipers operated under the polar sun. There, the enemy was not hunger, but perpetual light. Nights disappeared for weeks, and any movement could be seen from kilometers away. The women devised camouflage from branches and painted fabrics, taking advantage of the reflections of the fjords. In summer, insects were a constant torment. In winter, the ice made it impossible to move without noise. Still, they held positions against German mountain divisions and Finnish units. The northern snipers also learned to work as scouts. They were the eyes of the front, observing from a distance, marking targets for artillery or recording enemy advances. Their most valuable contribution was not a shot, but precise observation. In a war of attrition, every piece of information counted. Among the veterans of the Leningrad front, Valentina Belova stood out, a young woman of barely 19 years who survived the 3 winters of the siege. Her official record counted 108 enemies killed. In her diary, found after her death, she wrote, "Snow covers everything, even names. But the telescopic sight does not lie. Where I put my eye, the world stops." That phrase became a kind of prayer among the snipers who followed in her footsteps. Over the months, the siege of Leningrad became a symbol of Soviet resistance. The snipers did not only defend positions, they defended the very idea of survival. While civilians froze to death in their homes, they held the invisible line separating the city from extermination. Their precision was a form of hope. Every enemy eliminated meant a few more hours of life for those still resisting. When the blockade was finally lifted in January 1944, many of these women had died or were unrecognizable from hunger. The survivors returned to the city with tattered uniforms and fingers mutilated by frost. They were received in silence. The war continued on other fronts, and there was no time for heroes. Only much later would the role they played in sustaining morale and defense be understood. The Northern Front had shown that cold could be as relentless an enemy as fire. And in that frozen expanse, the Soviet snipers learned to use it to their advantage. Ice became their camouflage, wind their ally, snow their accomplice. They had turned nature itself into a weapon. When the German divisions began retreating west, the northern snipers advanced silently, covering the tracks of fleeing soldiers. Behind them, the tundra was littered with rusty shells and frozen bodies, silent witnesses to a war without borders. But in the southern skies, another type of women fought a different battle. They did not shoot from the ground, but from the air. While the snipers operated in the shadows, they attacked at night, dropping bombs from old wooden biplanes. They were the invisible enemies of the sky, feared by the Germans under the name the Night Witches. The Night Witches versus the female snipers. In the vast theater of the Soviet war, the figure of the female combatant took many forms. In the air and on the ground, thousands of them fought for the same cause, but with radically different means. While snipers acted silently, hidden under layers of snow or dust, the pilots of the 588 Night Bomber Regiment, known to the Germans as the Night Witches, soared through the skies with the roar of aged engines and the thunder of bombs. Both embodied the transformation of the Soviet woman into a war instrument, invisible or conspicuous but equally feared. The nickname Night Witches was not a Soviet invention but a German one. Wehrmacht soldiers, unable to detect the planes until the bombs fell, claimed to hear the sound of flying brooms in the darkness. Those rustic Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes, made of wood and canvas, moved slowly over enemy lines, without lights, without defensive weapons, piloted by young women who had barely finished their training. The contrast with the snipers was absolute. Where some fired a single precise bullet, the others rained fire from the sky. Yet the spirit was the same. Snipers and aviators shared the same ideological origin, the project of absolute equality promoted by the Soviet state and forged in the necessity of total war. Both units were a product of the same historical moment when the country, on the brink of collapse, decided that gender no longer mattered. Only efficiency counted. The 588th Regiment was created in 1942 at the initiative of Marina Raskova, a famous pilot and national heroine, who convinced Stalin to form 3 exclusively female air units. One of them, the night bombing unit, would soon become legendary. The flights were conducted in complete darkness, no radio, no instruments, no guidance. The pilots flew in pairs, just as snipers operated on the ground. The analogy was perfect. One observed, the other executed. The risks were similar. A single bullet or burst was enough to end the mission. If shot down, the aviators had no parachutes. They knew capture meant torture or death. Snipers, in contrast, faced an equally silent fate. Discovered, they were mercilessly executed. No one expected to return alive. Both shared this implicit fatality, fulfilling duty even if the cost was existence itself. The Soviet state knew how to leverage this duality for propaganda. In the press, the night witches represented boldness. The snipers, precision. One was the flame, the other the ice. The former embodied attack, the latter defense, yet both were presented as symbols of the moral power of the socialist woman, capable of matching or surpassing men in any realm of sacrifice. In 1943 newspapers, portraits of smiling aviators and mud-covered snipers appeared side by side under the same motto: "The enemy fears both the sky and the earth." In fact, there was a deep mutual admiration between them. The aviators flew over the positions where the snipers hid. From the air, they saw the flashes of solitary gunfire. From the ground, the shooters heard the distant hum of engines at night. They did not know each other, but they knew they were companions in the same cause. The personal diaries of both branches mention this silent connection. One pilot wrote, "When I hear the shot of a sniper, I feel that the ground fights with me too." The night witches were the visible face of Soviet nocturnal terror. Their missions interrupted the sleep of the Germans, leaving them in a state of permanent vigilance. The snipers did the same during the day, turning every sunrise into an invisible threat. Together, the two forces generated constant psychological pressure on the enemy. Modern warfare became a spectacle of precision and fear. However, their daily lives were opposite. The aviators returned to their bases after each flight, sharing tea, nervous laughter, and improvised mechanics. The snipers spent whole days buried in trenches without human contact. Some faced danger in motion, the others in absolute stillness. Both learned to live with death, but in different ways. Those in the air confronted it face to face, those on the ground waited silently. Tactically, both units demonstrated remarkable efficiency. The Night Witches carried out over 23,000 missions and dropped more than 3,000 tons of bombs on German positions. The snipers, in turn, confirmed tens of thousands of individual casualties and dismantled entire units through selective elimination of officers. One represented industrial warfare, the other personal warfare. But while female aviation was celebrated with public honors, the snipers carried a darker aura. Soviet propaganda preferred to show heroines flying in the sky, not women shooting at human faces from a distance. The rifle created a discomfort society preferred not to face directly. The airplane was heroic, the sniper necessary. The night witches were glorified as brave and graceful, while the shooters were described with distant respect. Glory and silence, two fates of the same sacrifice. Yet the lines that separated them were thin. In 1944, several veterans of the ground front were invited to visit air bases where they met the pilots. In a photograph taken in Poland, they are seen together, some covered in mud, others in soot. They smile with crossed arms, unaware that both images would be used in the following years as symbols of the same myth. The Soviet woman turned into a weapon. The enemy did not distinguish between them. To the Germans, all were witches, creatures that defied the logic of the battlefield. They called them that not only out of fear, but out of incomprehension. In their mindset, a woman should neither kill nor fly, let alone do so with such effectiveness. In prisoner interrogations, German officers described their troops' bewilderment. These women feel no mercy. They are like the Russian climate, cold and constant. At the end of the war, both units shared the same fate. The survivors were honored, but soon relegated to silence. The victorious Soviet Union did not know how to integrate women who had lived the war with equal or greater intensity than men. Some of the aviators managed to continue their careers in civil or military aviation. The snipers, on the other hand, returned to invisibility. Many found no work, others never spoke of what they had done. In later Soviet manuals, it was said that aviators represented the will to move and the snipers the will to control. Both were expressions of the same psychological principle, eliminating fear through repetition. On the front, however, this theory had a face. The night witches illuminated the night with fire, the snipers extinguished the day with silence. Between them, the enemy learned a lesson, that Soviet warfare had two faces and both were female. But beyond precision and courage, there was something deeper. In the recovered diaries of these combatants, the word fear appears over and over, not fear of dying, but of failing. Failing meant wasting a bullet, a bomb, a collective effort. In that shared fear, sky and earth united. The use of fear as a weapon. In modern warfare, precision and psychology converge. It is not enough to kill the enemy, it is necessary to break their will. On the Eastern Front, Soviet female snipers understood that fear could be as effective as the bullet. Their weapon was not just the rifle, but the invisible sensation they left after each shot, the certainty that someone was watching silently from an unknown place. Fear was not seen, but it was felt. German soldiers described it as a weight on the back of the neck, a constant presence. The echo of a single shot was enough to paralyze an entire company. No one knew where death came from or when it would appear again. That uncertainty, more than the actual danger, was the true power of the snipers. They were invisible, unreachable, and their lethality lay precisely in what could not be seen. In Wehrmacht combat manuals, a special section was even included on how to face Soviet snipers. The recommendations were almost useless. Move in zigzag, avoid reflections, do not smoke, do not stick your head out. But nothing could protect them from paranoia. Every broken window, every hole in a wall, every shadow in the snow could hide a deadly gaze. The Eastern Front became a psychological territory, where Germans learned that the most feared enemy made no noise. The snipers soon understood that this effect was part of their mission. Soviet instructors taught it explicitly: do not always shoot. Sometimes it is enough for them to hear you. The calculated use of silence was encouraged. A single well-executed shot could unleash hours of panic, slow the enemy's advance, and create internal suspicion among officers. The Germans began to distrust their own movements, their own maps. In 1943 reports, one commander wrote, "The enemy has learned to fight with the air. He kills without showing himself. He forces us to fear even when he is not there." Fear became a war of attrition tactic. In Stalingrad, Leningrad, Smolensk, or Sevastopol, snipers were assigned to sectors where enemy morale needed to be disrupted. They remained hidden for days, shooting sporadically to maintain the sense of constant surveillance. They did not seek to kill more, but better. They knew the human mind cannot endure prolonged fear. With each day of tension, fatigue and paranoia did the rest. The Germans began devising desperate countermeasures. In the trenches, they hung helmets on rods to provoke shots. They placed dolls or mirrors as decoys. The snipers rarely fell for the trap. They waited. They observed. Sometimes they let the enemy believe they had won, only to shoot hours later when fear had turned into confidence. In psychological warfare, patience was the cruelest weapon. For Soviet snipers, fear was not just an external instrument, it was also an internal enemy. They learned to live with it, to breathe it, to master it until it became part of the combat ritual. In their diaries, many described the tension before a shot as a trance state. Rosa Shanina, one of the most outstanding at the front, wrote, "Before I shoot, fear sits with me. I let it be." If I reject it, I tremble. If I accept it, it disappears. This self-mastery made them invincible. The Red Army, aware of the symbolic power of these women, amplified their legend. News reports spoke of the invisible Soviet terror. The press presented them as the most elegant weapon on the front, a combination of precision, intelligence, and patriotism. But the reality was darker. Fear was neither clean nor heroic. It was a poison that contaminated everything. Some snipers developed insomnia, hallucinations, or chronic tremors. Living so long in the silence of the hunt altered the mind. Psychological warfare exacted its toll even on those who mastered it. In medical reports from 1944, several Soviet military psychiatrists described a recurring phenomenon among veteran snipers: post-shot stillness. After eliminating an enemy, many remained motionless for hours, unable to move, trapped between euphoria and emptiness. It was neither guilt nor remorse. It was the suspension of time. They had turned the act of killing into a process so precise it bordered on ceremonial. Fear was also a language. In sniper duels, it was used as a form of communication. Two shooters could spend days hunting each other without ever seeing one another. A single movement, a reflex, a vibration in the air was enough. One knew that the other was there, waiting. Sometimes neither fired. It was a mental battle, a silent conversation where the will to survive was measured in seconds. Female snipers learned to use waiting as provocation, prolonging the tension until the opponent broke. In that invisible war, victory was psychological long before it became physical. Letters from captured German soldiers on the front confirm this terror. "You can't breathe, we feel their eyes even at night. They don't move, they don't speak, they only shoot when we want to believe they are gone." In another, a non-commissioned officer begged his wife not to go alone into the forest because even the trees here seemed to watch. Fear had stopped being an emotion. It was a presence. Soviet female snipers became an extension of the landscape, a part of the hostile nature, snow, mud, and darkness allied with them. As the war advanced westward, the psychological effect grew. The Germans knew that Soviet territory was full of invisible eyes. Every hill could conceal a shot, every shadow a sight adjustment. In that symbiosis with the environment, fear became art. The shooters no longer needed to move much, their reputation did the work. The legend spread faster than bullets. Rumors of snipers who could pierce the heart from a kilometer away or kill the highest-ranking officer in a single shot circulated among enemy troops. German propaganda tried to reverse that terror, describing them as hysterical fanatics, but no one believed it. The men on the front knew that these shadows did not scream, they just waited. In liberated cities, when the Soviets advanced, many German soldiers refused to look out the windows or go into the yards, even after combat had ended. Fear persisted beyond battle. It was the legacy of a war where the enemy could not be seen but was always present. The Soviet state had understood a fundamental truth. Fear was a force multiplier. It required no ammunition, no transport, no maintenance. It was economical, effective, and contagious. A handful of motionless women was enough to halt the advance of hundreds of men. In that equation, fear became military policy, but also a burden. The female snipers lived with that silence even after the war. They returned home unable to sleep, unable to live in places where no one watched them. Some kept waking at the slightest sound, others refused to ever touch a weapon again. The fear they had used as a tool remained with them as a shadow. In the archives of the Central Museum of the Armed Forces in Moscow, an anonymous letter dated 1946 is preserved. It is written by a former sniper to her former commander. "He taught us that fear was our weapon, but he did not say it would also be our wound." With the end of the war in sight and the enemy finally in retreat, fear began to transform into something else: memory. The women who had lived among shadows began to write, to bear witness. Letters, diaries, fragments of confessions accumulated like echoes of a generation that had learned to master terror and at the same time fear its return. Personal accounts, diaries, letters, and memoirs. Letters used to begin with simple words like "Dear Mother" or "My Dear Sister," but ended with phrases that betrayed an inner abyss. Rosa Shanina, in her 1944 notebook, wrote, "When I shoot, I feel neither joy nor hatred. I feel that I am fulfilling a duty. But sometimes I wonder if that is also feeling she was barely 20 years old and had already accumulated more than 50 confirmed kills." Others, like Yelena Kolobaeva, wrote about loneliness. In a letter sent from the Karelia front, she confessed, "The hardest part is not killing, but not being able to speak. One day passes, another day passes, and I don't hear my voice. Only the wind and the click of the bolt, for many silence was the cruelest enemy. Not the German hiding among the trees, but the inner echo that followed them after the shot." Some of those letters survived because they were confiscated by military censorship, others because family members hid them in boxes among photographs and medals. Today they rest in museums or archives, written in pencil on yellowed paper. They reveal the tone of a generation that learned to write from the edge of death. There is no drama, only observation. "Today I killed 2, the third escaped, I didn't sleep. Tomorrow I will calculate better," Nadezhda Belkina noted in January 1943. The precision of military language had contaminated her life. Emotions were counted in numbers. Some drew small maps or sketches of the terrain next to the names of their victims. It was their way of remembering order in a chaotic world. Diaries also reflect camaraderie. In pauses between missions, women shared frozen bread, combed each other's hair, or sang songs from their youth. "We laugh when the wind changes," wrote a sniper from Leningrad. "It's the only thing that still moves without orders." That persistent humanity, hidden beneath the uniform, was what kept them alive. However, over time, guilt began to seep into the accounts. Post-war texts reveal a different note: melancholy, distance, a kind of moral void. We were precise, but we never knew what it turned into afterward. The silence after victory was as heavy as that of war. No one wanted to hear their stories. Some tried to rebuild civilian life. They married, worked, raised children. But at night, they still looked through the telescopic sight. "Sometimes I close my eyes," confessed Klavdia Kalugina, one of the survivors, "and I feel I'm still aiming, not at an enemy, but at the past." Diaries, letters, and memoirs today form the purest voice of those women. Without heroism, without embellishment, they narrate a personal war within the collective war. The precision of their shots became precision of memory, every sentence a target on pain. In those pages there is no glory, only testimony. Women who learned to look without blinking, to live silently, to disappear when everyone watched. Their fragmented, silent memory is perhaps the truest portrait of the cost of victory. But the war was not over, and for many of them, surviving did not mean returning. Those who returned home found that the country they had sworn to protect no longer had room for them. The end of the war and the fate of the survivors. When the Soviet Union celebrated victory over Germany in May 1945, the streets of Moscow, Kiev, and Minsk were filled with flags and songs. But among the millions of smiling faces, there were some that remained silent. The female snipers who had served on the harshest fronts for 4 years returned without knowing how to become part of the civilian world again. The roar of the parades could not erase the echo of their shots. The state had needed them when the homeland bled, but no longer knew what to do with them. Female units were disbanded shortly after the victory. Military posts were again filled with men. Many had their ranks, uniforms, and with them the identity they had built on the battlefield taken away. In the villages, poverty and mistrust awaited them. Some were welcomed with pride, others with suspicion. Soviet society still did not understand how a woman could have killed so many men and still be a mother, wife, or teacher. Rosa Shanina died before seeing the end, struck by artillery fire in East Prussia. Lyudmila Pavlichenko turned into a legend, gave lectures and wrote memoirs, but ended up confined in a modest Moscow apartment marked more by the wounds of the soul than the body. Klavdia Kalugina, one of the youngest, survived the front and lived to an advanced age, but rarely spoke about her combat years. She said that when she closed her eyes, she was still looking through the telescopic sight. Silence became her uniform. In the following decades, Soviet propaganda exalted collective heroism, but avoided delving into individual stories. Snipers were portrayed on posters, not in books. At official events, their names were pronounced alongside thousands of soldiers, as if anonymity were another form of discipline. Official memory preferred myth over truth. In the 1950s, some veterans were invited to schools to share their experiences. Children listened with fascination, but the questions were always the same. How many did you kill? Were you afraid? Did you ever cry? They answered little. They knew history was not interested in understanding, only in admiring. In private, the return was harder. Many carried silent traumas, insomnia, trembling, inability to endure the noise of fireworks. There was no diagnosis, but the suffering was evident. Some isolated themselves, others drank to sleep, others wrote without publishing. In the Soviet Union, there was no space for vulnerability. They had been heroes. They were not allowed to be human. Over time, the few survivors became living witnesses to a chapter the country preferred to forget. In the 1980s, when the archives began to open, historians discovered the scale of the phenomenon. Over 2,000 trained snipers, around 500 decorated, and hundreds disappeared without record. Their contribution had been crucial in dozens of battles, but their names had vanished in the reports. At the end of the 20th century, Russia and Ukraine began erecting monuments in their honor. In Sevastopol, a bronze statue shows a woman with her rifle resting, gaze lost on the horizon. She has no name because she represents all. Her face is serene, but her empty eyes seem still to search for something that never returned. Soviet snipers did not only win battles, they gained a place in history that no one gave them. They were the silent voice of a war that shaped them and forgot them at the same time. They returned from the front without visible medals, but with an unerasable certainty. In the darkest moment of the century, when death ruled Europe, they learned to face nothingness without blinking.